G'day, g'day. Welcome to Big Bucks Bogan Theory. You're going to love it. So, today we're going to compare and contrast the Paretoan versus the Marxist analytical toolkit. And if you're like me and you wind up rejecting the Marxist toolkit in favour of Pareto, we're also going to have a look at what can be salvaged from the Marxist toolkit because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know. But before we start, I just want to quickly tell you how I approach intellectual lenses. So I'm not the biggest expert on the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, but I reckon his concept of the clearing is pretty cool. So for Heidegger, the idea of the clearing is basically about how the world reveals and hides itself to us. He got the idea about the clearing from walking in a forest. Imagine you're in a thick bushland, trees everywhere, and it's hard to see more than a few feet in front of you. Then you step into a clearing. Suddenly there's light. You can see the sky, maybe even spot where you are in the scrub, and things open up. For Heidegger, the clearing is where truth shows itself, but only because there's also stuff still being hidden, just like the rest of the forest around it. Here's another way to think about it. Hold out the palms of your hands and look at your palms. Now turn them over. One side's visible, the other side's hidden. Flip them back and forth. You can't see both sides at once, right? But each side tells you something different about your hands. That's how understanding works. Something always gets revealed, and something always gets concealed. So when I talk about intellectual lenses, I think of them like different clearings. Each lens, whether it's a philosophical lens, a sociological lens, or various political theories, they open up a certain space or terrain. It lets us see particular things clearly, but there's always stuff outside the frame. And certain things will always be distorted by the lens as well. That's why I don't treat any single intellectual lens as gospel. I try my best to oscillate between different ones and see what each lens reveals and try to keep conscious the fact that they're also hiding things too. Metaphysics. Metaphysical Materialism versus Pragmatic Agnosticism. In order to understand this, we're going to have to backtrack to Immanuel Kant. So I've got to let you know, I've never actually read Kant by himself. My understanding of this stuff comes 100% through my reading of Schopenhauer. But in philosophy, Kant is known for what is called the Copernican revolution. Before Kant, most people thought the mind just receives information from the outside world like it's a blank slate. But Kant turned that idea on its head. He argued that the mind actually shapes how we experience the world. So we don't just experience and absorb reality raw. We take in sense data, colours, sounds, textures, and then our minds go to work. We impose certain structures onto that data. Things like three-dimensional space, time, and causality aren't actually out there in the world. They're the frameworks our minds automatically use to organise our experience. So in a sense, we oppose them on the world. Schopenhauer picked this up and said that the world we see is a representation. Not in the sense that it's fake, but that it's filtered. It's shaped by how our minds are wired. So we never experience the world as it actually is. We only ever experience it as it appears to us. This leads to an important distinction: the phenomenal world, the world we can see, touch, and think about, and the noumenal world, which is reality as it exists beyond our perception. And here's the thing: we can never directly access the noumenal world. It's off limits. Our minds are built to process appearances, not the things in themselves. It's what people mean when they talk about an epistemic limit. There's a boundary to what we can actually know, and we can't step outside our own perception to see what's really there. So, when it comes to big metaphysical questions, like what reality is ultimately made of, the underlying substance of the universe, Kant's view is that we've hit a wall. We can ask those questions, we can speculate, but we're always working from inside a human frame. It's a humbling idea, but a useful one. It reminds us that a lot of what we take for granted, space, time, cause and effect, even numbers, might not be features of the world out there at all. They could just be how our minds make sense of our experience. So, to circle back around to Pareto versus Marx, it should be noted that while Pareto absolutely goes to town against Kant when it comes to his ethics, like he tears him to fucking shreds, he more or less accepts Kant's idea of an epistemic limit. The idea that there's a hard limit to what we can actually know about reality beyond our perception. So Pareto was very much against building some grand metaphysical system. What he was more focused on was what people actually do, their instincts, their justifications, and the stories that they tell themselves. In some ways, he was quite modest. He doesn't pretend to have access to the thing in itself. That's a very Kantian move, even if you'd never really admit that. Now, Marx, on the other hand, who was influenced by Hegel, who himself was hugely influenced by Kant, just shrugs off the whole idea of an epistemic limit. He doesn't say we can't know the essence of reality. He says we do know it. It's matter. That's it. The world is made of matter, history unfolds through material forces, and everything else, religion, philosophy, ethics, is just the superstructure built on that base. As I mentioned in the previous video, Marx treats people's religious, metaphysical, and ethical beliefs as illusions, products of material conditions that need to be stripped away or overcome. And here's the problem: those beliefs, those frameworks, often matter deeply to the very people Marx claims to be fighting for. So instead of connecting with them, he ends up alienating them, telling working people that their traditions, their values, their view of the world is just false consciousness. Not a particularly winning strategy, is it? Now contrast that with Pareto. Pareto doesn't make sweeping claims about what's ultimately real. He's a pragmatic agnostic. He doesn't say people's beliefs are true, but he doesn't treat them as delusions to be corrected. He sees them as expressions of deeper instincts, what he calls residues, and he tries to understand how they play out in real life. And that's the key difference. Marx is an ontological materialist. He thinks matter is the fundamental substance of reality. Pareto, on the other hand, is a methodological materialist. He's not making metaphysical claims, he's just using material conditions and human behaviour as a way to study how societies function. It's a tool, not a worldview. If we're to pivot back to Schopenhauer for a second, for him, what we call matter is just the mind's crude attempt to represent the things in themselves, something we'll never fully grasp. And when I think about Marx and his materialism, I'm reminded of that Schopenhauer quote: the materialist is the subject who forgets to take account of themselves. You're still a perceiving subject, interpreting the world through your own filters. And once you forget that, you start mistaking the map for the territory. So now we're going to move on to talking about dialectical views of history versus the view of history as flux. So the history of dialectics goes back a long way. It appears in the ancient Greek pre-Socratics like Heraclitus, who said things like, everything flows, and strife is the father of all things. Later on, Plato used dialectics as a method of questioning and working towards truth through conversation. But the big turning point in history of philosophy apparently came with Hegel, a thinker I must admit I've never read. Supposedly, Hegel saw history and reality itself as unfolding through contradictions. One position gives rise to its opposite, and the tension between them leads to a new synthesis. That synthesis then becomes the new position, which creates a new opposition, and it goes on and on and on and on. History, in his view, has a kind of deep structure to it, and a rhythm of self-overcoming. And later on, Marx was influenced by Hegel, but turned him on his head. Instead of ideas driving change, Marx said it's material conditions, how people produce, distribute, and relate to labour, that shape everything. Marx said that history moves through stages based on contradictions between the forces of production and the relations of production. So things like class conflict become the engine of historical change. And this movement isn't random. Supposedly, it follows a path. You start with primitive communism, or what we'd probably call today hunter-gatherer societies, and then they move on to slave societies, and then feudalism, and then feudalism gave way to capitalism, and according to them, capitalism will go into crisis, we'll get socialism, and then finally socialism will give way to communism. And that's what the Marxists call dialectical materialism. Marxism has a kind of teleological view of history, meaning it has an end goal, a destination it's supposedly moving towards. That said, not all Marxists are that strict about it. If you've ever read Mao, he actually recognises that contradiction is eternal. Even under the high stages of communism, struggle continues. So there's a bit of a tension within the Marxist tent about where the history really ends. To be honest, dialectical materialism and dialectics in general don't really make any sense to me. But who knows? I might just be too smooth-brained for it. So years ago, I used to chat to an American tankie on Facebook, and he was a pretty nice bloke. And he once told me that he thought I was a unconscious dialectical thinker. I took it as a compliment, but I reckon he was mixing up his dialectical method with my approach of treating different intellectual lenses as Heideggerian clearings. So, if you adopt two contradictory philosophical lenses and jump between the two, you kind of have to be comfortable with a contradiction there. But that said, I don't really think it's the same thing as what Marxists are doing. You often see Marxists use phrases like dialectics, one-sidedness, or historically progressive. And who knows, they might actually mean something by it. But it often comes across to me, they seem, to borrow a bit of Pareto's terminology, like they're just using derivations to rationalise whatever they want. And if you think about it, one of the paradoxes you can say in dialectical thinking is that if you take it seriously, every position you hold is inevitably one-sided. Everything's in contradiction, which means something else is just going to come along and contradict it. That means your perspective is always wrong, in some way at least, and it will eventually be superseded. So why take a position at all? Why commit to anything in particular? Especially if it's just going to be negated. Like, at the end of the day, I personally just think dialectics is a little bit silly. Now, if we're to contrast Marx's dialectical view of history with that of Pareto's, Pareto saw the world not as a story of progress, but as a condition of constant flux. History, in his view, doesn't progress or move towards a goal, nor does it follow grand metaphysical cycles. Although he does acknowledge that there are patterns of fluctuation in the elite that could probably be perceived as cyclical, but it's not exactly. So while he acknowledged material and scientific advances, he rejected the idea that history moves inevitably towards a greater freedom or justice. Instead, he saw the same irrational impulses, residues, playing out beneath ever-changing political and ideological masks. Societies reorganise, elites rise and fall, but human nature and power dynamics remain remarkably constant. For Pareto, grand theories of history, whether they promise progress or prophesize decline, are just derivations. The belief that society is moving inevitably towards justice, equality, or liberation is a rationalization built on emotional residues, often the desire to systematize, to hope, or to moralize. Likewise, the idea that civilizations rise and fall according to spiritual or organic cycles is just another comforting narrative. An attempt to impose meaning and order onto the world governed by irrational impulses and shifting power. Both serve to justify a worldview or political instinct, not to uncover the true mechanics of social change. Beneath these stories, Pareto sees only flux, elite rotation, and the enduring irrationality of human nature. For a brief second, we're going to stop, and I'm just going to make a few personal remarks regarding the myths of progress and the myths of the cyclical view of history. So, Pareto is probably right that history is flux, and these different myths are just derivations to rationalize these impulses and make sense of the world. That said, I do think, considering how hegemonic the myth of progress has been here in the West, and especially how our elites and how the educated classes, especially here in Australia, tend to use the myth of progress, and like it's undeniable that it is the animating myth, or it's one of the major animating myths of our educated classes, that at least maybe embracing thinkers like, say, Oswald Spengler, like it is a bit of an antidote to the hubris, the ideological hubris that our educated classes have, to be able to think outside the hegemonic worldview of the time being. And, the traditionalists, they aren't exactly wrong that the doctrine of the Four Ages, you got your Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, or, the Kali Yuga. This is a reoccurring myth throughout a big portion of the world's population and world history. So it obviously served some purpose, even if it is just a derivation. And while I have extremely negative views of the myth of progress, and especially how the Western elite have used it, and when I wrestle with Marxism, I do fail to distinguish too much between, say, the Whig theory of history and the Marxist view of history. To me, they seem very like variations on the same myth. That said, like there'll probably be a lot of people listening to this that would think I'm a right winger. And like, I don't really know if right wing and left wing really mean much anymore, especially the deeper you go into Pareto. But there'll probably be a few people out there to be shocked that I do have some sympathy for, say, actually existing socialism or, communist countries. And I'm not going to deny that a lot of fucking bad shit happened over there. I'm not going to deny that at all. But me embracing a more Paretoan view of things, I kind of think that actually existing socialism or communism or whatever you want to call it is basically a form of developmental nationalism with a managerial elite on top, and the Marxism-Leninism as an ideology basically functions as what Gaetano Mosca would have called a political formula. And some of my sympathy towards it is the fact that, it's like what I think it really is a form of developmental nationalism. And if you're out there and you're like me and you think, hey, developing your country and trying to raise the living standards of your own people is a good thing to do, I do kind of wonder if I should be not as hostile to the myth of progress as I am when it comes to our own elite using that myth. Because, like, say, if you look at, say, the Communist Party of China, like, I don't want Australia to be ruled by them, like, don't get me wrong, but a big part of their legitimacy is connected to the fact that they are, like, just a big part of their legitimacy is tied to the fact that they are. It's expected of them that they're going to raise the living standards of their people, or they're going to get the living standard to a space where it's on par with the West, and they're going to keep it there. And if they fail to perform, they're going to lose legitimacy. And it does make me wonder if, say, the myth of progress or the myth of that the Marxists have of their various stages of history, if they didn't have that as a derivation, would they be less inclined to raise the living standards of their people? Like, as I'm getting older, I probably do have maybe a less hostile stance towards the myth of progress, because of the myth can be used as a way to rationalize lifting your own people up. All right, so now we're going to check out the role material conditions play in Pareto's system and how that stacks up against the Marxist view. So we all know that in Marxism, material conditions are front and center. It's all about how people produce and reproduce the means of life, how those economic structures shape everything. Class, politics, culture, you name it. Marx basically sees the economy as the engine room of history. Now, Pareto doesn't necessarily disagree about that material conditions still matter. But he's got a different way of looking at it from them. For him, material needs and interests are part of what motivates people, sure, but they're filtered through something deeper, residues and derivations. So instead of saying people act this way because of their class position, Pareto might say people act this way because they have certain emotional and instinctive residues, and then they dress those up with fancy rationalizations after the fact. Material interests still play a role, but they're definitely not the whole show. Think of it like this. Where Marx sees history as driven by objective class conflict and material conditions, Pareto sees history as driven by elite circulation, psychological constants, and the way people justify their actions, whether those justifications are based on material interests or not. Marx thinks you can diagnose those contradictions in society and work towards a rational system that reflects the real interests of the working class. Pareto's more like, yeah, nah, people aren't that rational. They're driven by instincts, passions, and habits. And no matter what system, elites of whatever kind will always manage to find a way on top. That doesn't mean Pareto ignores economics. He absolutely tracks changes in wealth, power, production, etc., etc. But he's more interested in how those interact with elite behaviour, emotional residues, and the stories people tell themselves. So, yeah, material conditions matter to both thinkers, but for Marx, they're the foundation of everything. For Pareto, they're just one part of a more complex and often irrational human picture. Personally, I think Pareto has the more honest take here. As much as I do have a lot of respect for some of Marxism's insights and some of its analysis, it sometimes feels a bit too fucking autistic, to be honest. Like, here's the base, there's the superstructure, here's the end goal, and like, you just have to go outside and you realize like the real world isn't that tidy. Pareto reminds us that people don't just respond to their conditions, they often interpret them, misread them, and justify them in weird and often contradictory ways. Which, if you ever fucking walked outside or went into a factory, you'd fucking see that, like, just firsthand. And, like, when you think about it, like, say, something like fucking Twitter, or X as it's now called, it's fairly obvious that it's just people's monkey brains going spastic at each other, and they're flinging words at each other rather than fucking flinging shit. In my mind, that kind of reinforces Pareto's residues and derivations model. Anyway, just something to keep in mind when you hear people talk about material analysis. It's important, but it's not the whole story. Alright, we're going to do a quick refresher before we dive in further, especially if you missed the earlier video where I unpacked all this in more detail. So, in Pareto's system, human behaviour is mostly made up of non-logical actions. That doesn't mean irrational in the crazy sense. It just means people's actions that aren't based on a tight chain of reasoning from premise to conclusion. You know, like when people get heated over the footy, or vote for someone because they feel right, or buy crystals to water bad vibes, like, which, you know, if I'm going to be honest, it's something I do. Well, and then you've also got logical actions. Logical actions are where the reasoning actually matches the outcome, like solving a maths problem or fixing a leaking tap. But those are rare in human history. Pareto reckons most of the stuff we think is logical really isn't. It's just logic based on after the fact, a post hoc rationalization. That's where residues and derivations come in. Residues are the deep, gut level drives, emotional instincts, stuff like the need to belong, dominate, build, tear down, help people, or feel important. These are basic drives which are the raw fuel for action. Derivations are the post hoc explanations we slap on it. They're the pretty sounding rationalizations, like, I oppose this policy on moral grounds, when really it's just that it threatens your tribe or your ego or your banking account. And the real fun part, instrumentalization. This is when those noble sounding derivations get used strategically, not just to explain behaviour, but to sell it, to justify it, to win support, or to silence critics. And we do have to keep in mind that most often when derivations are being instrumentalized, the person using it 90% of the time is a sincere believer in their own bullshit. Elites do this constantly. They'll frame a power grab as a moral duty. Regular people do it too. Like, I'm not yelling at my neighbour because I'm petty. I'm doing it because they violated my rights. So to sum it up, most human behaviour is non-logical, driven by residues, then justified with derivations. And derivations can be weaponized turn into tools to manipulate perception. Pareto's not saying people never act logically, just that logic tends to be confined to specific domains, like in maths, engineering, or science. We're often dealing with logical actions. There's a clear goal and method. But outside that, especially in social settings, politics, relationships, it's actually pretty rare. We think we're being rational, but most of the time we're just running off vibes and then writing the script afterwards. Anyway, that's the framework. Residues, derivations, instrumentalization, and the dominance of non logical actions over logical. I already covered this more deeply in another video, but it's worth keeping in mind because once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Pareto versus Marx. Who rules, how, and why? And who are the elite? Let's begin with a simple but crucial question. Who rules society? For the Marxists, the answer is clear. The bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class rules. They control the economy, and through that, they dominate the political system, the culture, the education system, and even moral norms. The state and its institutions ultimately serve to protect their class interests. In this model, any other powerful group, whether they be politicians, journalists, in more religious times, the clergy, public intellectuals, they are either members of the bourgeoisie themselves or are subordinate to it. There's one ruling class, and its power flows from its economic base. Pareto sees things differently. For him, the key concept is not ownership, but ability, and governing or ruling ability in particular. He distinguishes between elites in general, the most capable or dominant in any field, or their offspring that might not actually be that capable, and the governing elite, those who actually wield direct control over the state apparatus. This includes politicians, generals, high-level bureaucrats, judges, the ones who give orders and shape policies. Outside of this are non-governing elites, powerful, wealthy, or influential people who do not directly control the machinery of the state. For example, a tech billionaire may have enormous wealth and indirect power. They can lobby, fund campaigns, buy a media empire of their own, or even bribe. But unless they hold a governing position or exert day-to-day authority within the state apparatus, they're not part of the governing elite. Likewise, a charismatic influencer or a public intellectual may shape the worldview of millions of people, but they're still a non-governing elite unless they wield actual institutional power. What is power and what is property? Next we ask, what is power actually based on? For Marx, power is structural. It flows from the ownership of the means of production. If you own land, factories, mines, or capital, you dominate those who must sell their labour to survive. Power here is tied to property relations, not to personality or persuasion. Every other form of power, political, legal, religious, ultimately serves to maintain these relations. If you don't change the economic base, you haven't changed the power structure. Pareto, on the other hand, takes a very different view. For him, power doesn't come from owning things, it comes from the ability to organise and rule or direct. Some elites do this through military force, others through ideological influence, others through bureaucracy, and others through religious authority. Property can be one source of power, but it's just one of many. A general without wealth may control a country. A priest may move millions. A civil servant or a party official may make life-altering decisions without ever owning capital. So while Marx sees property as the root of class domination, Pareto sees performance, capacity, and adaptability as what allows elites to rise and maintain control. How does change occur? Elite circulation versus class struggle. If Marx and Pareto disagree on who rules, They also disagree on how things change. For Marx, history moves through class struggle. Contradictions build up inside a given mode of production. The elite class exploits the lower class until the pressure reaches a breaking point. In capitalism, this means the proletariat, the working class, will eventually gain consciousness of its own condition, rise up, and overthrow the bourgeoisie. The result is a revolution that transforms not just the rulers, but the entire structure of society. Pareto, on the other hand, disagrees completely. He sees no final liberation, no end of history. For him, history is a story of elite circulation. Elites sometimes grow complacent, corrupt, or disconnected from the people they rule. Eventually, they are replaced, sometimes through elections, sometimes through coups, sometimes through revolution. But what replaces them is just another elite, often with different traits, but still an elite. The system doesn't break, it mutates. The form changes, the slogans change, but the underlying fact of rule remains. Bourgeois ideology versus the instrumentalization of derivations. Now, finally, let's talk about ideas, about why people believe what they believe. For Marx, the dominant ideas, whether they be nationalism, religion, liberalism, individualism, or meritocracy, are often part of bourgeois ideology. These ideas reflect the material interests of the ruling class and help legitimize their dominance. Religion, for example, might preach humility and obedience, useful traits for a factory worker. But here's the thing though, there are a lot of Marxists out there that will still critique these ideas as if the bourgeoisie still believe in them, when in fact many parts of the bourgeoisie have abandoned them. A modern elite may be deeply secular, cosmopolitan, and individualistic, but still accuse the working class of false consciousness for being patriotic or religious. Pareto would look at this very differently. He argues that people's actions are driven by deep-seated emotional and instinctive patterns, what he calls the residues, and that ideas or derivations come afterwards to justify and interpret those actions. People don't just use ideas cynically, they sincerely believe them, or at least 90% of the time. But elites are the ones who instrumentalize these beliefs, who select, amplify, and weaponize certain derivations to achieve their own ends. From a Paretoan perspective, it doesn't matter whether the idea is religious, secular, progressive, or traditional. Any set of derivations can and will be used by elites to justify their position or manipulate others. And a lot of the time, they might sincerely believe the derivations that they're instrumentalizing. So while Marx sees ideology as rooted in material class interest, Pareto sees ideology as a tool, a flexible instrument that's adapted to fit the mood and residues of the population. So what's salvageable within Marxism when reinterpreted through a Paretoan framework? So maybe you're the kind of person who accepts Kant's epistemic limit. You think there are boundaries to what human reason can know, and that the underlying substance of reality is beyond our perception. Or you're like me and you might privately hold religious or metaphysical beliefs, even if you don't always make a show of them. You might also find dialectics to be kind of silly, if not outright retarded. You might reject the idea that history has a built in direction, no belief that the world is marching towards some utopia. You might also feel that Pareto's theories of residues and derivations make way more sense of human behaviour than Marx's rational, mechanical, autistic materialism. You've seen how people act, and it's not based on reason or class interest most of the time. It's instinct, emotional, rituals, stories, sometimes noble, sometimes batshit insane. You probably also think that elite circulation explains more than what class struggle does. The names and faces change, but there will always be chiefs and Indians. There will always be an elite. And maybe what motivates you isn't class hatred or revolutionary zeal. Maybe you're motivated by different residues and derivations. Maybe patriotism, tradition, responsibility, or just wanting your country to be functional. Maybe you want a good economy, jobs that mean something, a society that takes care of its own, your family, your neighbours, your fellow Australians. And if any of this sounds like you, then it probably means the Marxist framework isn't for you. But this is a very important and crucial point. We can't ignore them entirely. Some Marxist thinkers still have some extremely important insights, especially if we reframe them through a Paretoan lens. Now, for a lot of us, especially if you're a white, Anglo-Celtic, blue-collar Aussie with so-called conservative instincts, every time you hear one of these dipshit inner-city lefties ranting on about imperialism or whatever bullshit buzzword they've come up with this week, it can't help but sound like it's just another way of saying white people are bad or the West is evil. And sometimes that's exactly what they're doing. But if we set the bullshit aside, some of the Marxist analysis underneath is still extremely important. Take Lenin's theory of imperialism, for example. Strip away the dogma, and what is he really saying? That once capitalism reaches a certain maturity, it starts looking outwards for new markets, new resources, cheap labour, places to dump surplus capital, and the need to keep subject areas underdeveloped in order to facilitate this. And that's how you get financial imperialism, where it's no longer about just war or conquest, but investment, debt, corporate capture, trade dependency. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what we're seeing in Australia right now. We are utterly dominated by foreign capital, be it American, Chinese, or whoever's offering the best deal at the time. Whole sectors, banking, energy, land, water rights, even housing, are increasingly owned by foreign interests. So even if you think Marxists are fuckheads, which they usually are, Lenin's diagnosis still applies. Not because we want a communist revolution, but because we're trying to understand the system we're stuck in. And if you care about your people, your region, your way of life, if you want this country to be more than just a big farm or a mine, something that's going to fuck us up in the new multipolar world order, then you got to wrestle with this stuff, even if it comes from people who you'd otherwise disagree with. And that's where Pareto becomes extremely useful. He helps you separate the analysis from the ideological baggage. You can salvage the insights, strip it off its teleology and utopianism and its crude materialism, and reframe it in a way that makes sense to people like us. So let us ask the core question. What aspects of Marxism are still useful when filtered through a Paretoan lens? Number one, exploitation is real, it's just not the whole story. Marx was right to highlight how people get squeezed, exploited, and alienated under capitalism. That still happens today. Just look at the casualisation of labour, wage stagnation, and the housing crisis. But Pareto helps us to see that this isn't always about class in the Marxist sense. It's about power and who controls the apparatus, whether that's business, bureaucracy, or media. The ones doing the exploiting aren't always the same class, and their justifications or derivations shift depending on the context. For example, a CEO is still technically a manager. And even though I personally believe that the state ownership of certain key industries would be a good thing for us to do as a country, we also have to recognise that the exploitation of the worker shifts from the private capitalist to the governing elite if we were to do this. Number two, ideology still functions, but not always cynically. Marxists talk about false consciousness, that people believe bourgeois ideology because they're tricked. Pareto takes a more nuanced view. People often believe the derivations they use, They're not just lying to others, they often believe it themselves. A politician doesn't say, I'm doing this to stay in power. He says, I'm doing this for the greater good. And he believes it. And this applies across ideologies, whether it's liberalism, socialism, nationalism, or even wokeism. Any derivation can be instrumentalized, not just so called bourgeois ones. Marxists often think religion or nationalism are bourgeois tricks, but those ideas can be, and have been, used against the bourgeoisie too. They're tools, not inherently left or right, or bourgeois or proletarian. Number 3, class struggle is friction, not salvation. Marx saw class struggle as the motor of history, pushing us towards liberation. Pareto, on the other hand, sees struggle as permanent, not necessarily progressive, but not necessarily reactionary either. Conflict between classes, factions, and elites is part of the natural cycle. You might get a revolution, sure, but the new ruling class will just impose its own derivations, its own residues, and the game will start over again. It's not good versus evil, it's one elite replacing another. You can salvage Marx's attention to conflict without swallowing the myth that at some point there's going to be a redemptive endpoint. Number 4, material conditions still matter. Pareto doesn't deny that material reality influences power or helps shape society. He just says it's not the only thing. Yes, access to capital matters, but so does control over logistics, infrastructure, energy, and supply chains. But human instincts, symbolic authority, and belief systems can be just as powerful. So you can keep the Marxist attention to who owns what, but reject the idea that ownership alone determines the outcome. Sometimes the symbol matters more than the factory. Salvaging Marxism through a Paretoan lens for nationalism and Australian patriotism. So why does this matter for someone who considers themselves a patriot or a nationalist, especially here in Australia? Because once you filter out the ideological garbage, Marxist tools can be used in service of national survival and renewal. You can use Marxist analysis of capital to understand why Australia is becoming a resource colony again. Not for the British time, but for global finance. You can use Lenin's theory of imperialism to frame how our sovereignty is hollowed out, not through tanks or guns, but through trade deals, debt, investment, and soft power. You can use class analysis, filtered through Pareto, to understand our own ruling class, who they are, how they circulate, what derivations they use to maintain control, for example, democracy, multiculturalism, and progress. You can still understand that moral or religious derivations, like love of country, duty to heritage, belief in the family, aren't outdated, and the underlying residues are vital in helping resist our elites' manipulation and can be instrumentalized in ways that serve the nation rather than hollow it out. So, no, you don't have to be a Marxist, but if you care about the future of this country, you should be willing to take certain Marxist thinkers seriously and then move beyond them with clearer eyes.